The sun was setting behind the jagged mountain peaks, casting long, golden shadows across the winding asphalt of the private mountain road. Jake, a three-time international racing champion, shifted the gears of his custom-built supercar with a smirk of pure arrogance. The engine's roar was the only music he cared for, a symphony of expensive Italian engineering that signaled his arrival to the world. For Jake, life was a race that he had already won, and anyone moving slower than him was simply an obstacle to be ignored or pushed aside in his pursuit of more fame and luxury. Deep in the heart of the forest, far from the neon lights of the city, a battered old pickup truck sat pulled over on the narrow shoulder of the road. Its hood was up, and a thin wisp of steam curled into the darkening sky. An elderly man named Silas, wearing oil-stained overalls and a faded cap, stood by the fender, holding a wrench in his weathered hands. Silas was more than just a mechanic. He was the man who had taught Jake how to drive in a dusty backyard long before the world knew his name. But today, Silas wasn't a father. He was a test. As Jake's silver blur of a car rounded the corner, he saw the old truck and the man waving for help. Instead of braking, Jake pushed the accelerator harder, the high-pitched scream of his engine echoing through the trees. He splashed through a puddle, drenching the old man in muddy water as he sped past. In his rearview mirror, Jake saw the fragile figure shaking ahead in disappointment, but he only laughed. To Jake, that man represented the life he had escaped, a life of dirt, grease, and insignificance that he never intended to revisit. "Get a real car, old-timer," Jake shouted into the wind, his voice swallowed by the roar of his exhaust. He checked his diamond-encrusted watch, calculating how quickly he could reach his hilltop villa to enjoy a glass of vintage wine. He felt untouchable, a king of the road who had outrun his humble beginnings. He didn't notice the small warning light flickering on his dashboard, nor did he hear the subtle change in the vibration of his high-performance tires as he hit a patch of loose gravel near a steep ravine. The crash happened in a heartbeat. A hidden jagged rock tore through Jake's front tire, sending the multi-million-dollar machine spinning out of control. The car careened off the road, crashing through thick underbrush and slamming into a massive oak tree at the bottom of a shallow embankment. The silence that followed was terrifying. Jake sat pinned in the wreckage, the smell of leaking fuel filling the air. His legs were trapped, and his phone had been crushed in the impact. The king of the road was now a prisoner in a cage of expensive carbon fiber. For an hour, Jake shouted for help, but the only response was the hoot of a distant owl. The cold mountain air began to seep into the cabin, and the fear of the car catching fire turned his blood to ice. He realized then that all his trophies, his bank accounts, and his famous friends were useless in the dark woods. He was just a man in a broken box, waiting for a miracle that he had spent his afternoon mocking. He closed his eyes, praying for the sound of any engine, even one that moved slowly. Then, he heard it, the rhythmic, clunking chug of an old diesel engine. The battered pickup truck he had splashed earlier pulled up to the edge of the embankment. Silas climbed out, his movements slow but deliberate. He didn't rush. He moved with the steady confidence of a man who knew exactly how the world worked. He looked down at the wreckage of the supercar, the headlights of his old truck illuminating the shattered remains of Jake's pride. Silas pulled a heavy tow chain from the back of his truck and began to descend the slope. Jake looked up, his face covered in dust and blood, as the silhouette of the old man approached. He didn't recognize Silas at first through the haze of pain. "Please," Jake gasped, his voice cracking. "I'll give you anything. Just get me out before it blows." Silas didn't say a word. He used a heavy pry bar to bend the door frame, his old muscles straining against the metal. With a grunt of effort, he cleared the path and pulled Jake from the wreckage just as the first flickers of flame appeared near the engine bay. Silas carried his son up the hill, his strength surprising for a man of his age. He laid Jake in the passenger seat of the old truck, the interior smelling of tobacco and old leather. As the truck groaned back to life, the heater humming with a steady, reliable warmth, Silas finally took off his cap. The light from the dashboard hit his face, and Jake's heart nearly stopped. "Dad?" he whispered, the realization hitting him harder than the crash ever could. You were the man on the road. Silas kept his eyes on the dark path ahead, his hands steady on the steering wheel. I saw a man today who thought he was faster than time itself, Silas said softly. I saw a man who thought a shiny coat of paint made him better than the soul underneath. I wanted to see if my son was still in there, or if he had been replaced by a machine. The silence in the cab was heavy with shame. Jake looked at his father's scarred, greasy hands, and then at the burning ruins of his supercar in the valley below. They drove in silence for miles, the old truck taking the bumps with a grace that Jake's supercar could never have managed. Jake watched the needles on the old gauges, realizing that this worthless junk was the only reason he was still breathing. He thought about the puddle he had splashed and the insults he had hurled. He realized that in his race to the top, he had become the very thing his father had always warned him about, a man who knew the price of everything but the value of nothing. When they reached the local clinic, Silas helped Jake inside but refused to leave his side. The doctors worked on Jake's injuries, but the real healing was happening in his mind. He watched Silas talk to the nurses with genuine respect, treating everyone as an equal. Jake saw how people responded to his father's quiet dignity, a kind of loyalty that money could never buy. He felt a deep, aching regret for the years he had spent looking down on the people who had built the world he was now standing in. The next morning, news of the crash hit the headlines, but Jake refused to give any interviews. He didn't want to talk about the car or the race. Instead, he sold his remaining supercars and donated the money to a fund for local mechanics and trade schools. He returned to his father's small garage, trading his silk suits for a pair of denim overalls. He spent his days learning the honest craft of repair, finding more satisfaction in fixing a neighbor's tractor than he ever had in winning a Grand Prix. Silas watched his son work from the corner of the garage, a small smile of pride finally returning to his face. He knew the lesson had been harsh, but it had saved more than just Jake's life. It had saved his character. Jake learned that the most important part of any vehicle is the person behind the wheel, and that the fastest way to get nowhere is to forget where you started. The old truck remained in the driveway, a rusting monument to the night the world slowed down enough for a champion to catch up with his own soul. Jake never returned to the professional circuit. Instead, he became a legend in the small mountain communities, known as the man who could fix anything with a smile and a story. He taught the local kids that life isn't about how fast you go, but about who you pick up along the way. And every rainy evening, when the mist rolls over the mountain road, he thinks of the old man with the wrench and the truck that moved slowly enough to see the truth. He finally realized that he wasn't a king of the road. He was just a son who had finally found his way home.